Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Guys, it's been a long journey, and this is one of those things that once it happens, I almost don't even know what I'm going to do with myself. But I want to follow through on this journey and talk about something that's going to be something we need to watch for if we see the move to 60%, which has been the target for years now. And I've said for a long time that Bitcoin dominance should reach 60% in Q4 of 2024. And it sure as hell seems like we're on track to make that really important milestone. I also want to talk a little bit about some some nuances to things, some obvious questions that you might have, and or at least questions that I think are reasonable questions to ask me, and I will try to talk about those as well. So let's go ahead and jump in here. Bitcoin dominance is at 59%, and it has been one hell of a rally, guys. If you look at month, I'm excited. What can I say? But if you look at monthly candles, I've had a thesis on altcoins for a long time, and it's basically just, let the degens lose their money trading them while they put in lower highs against Bitcoin, and they lose their Satoshi valuation to Bitcoin. And it's been such an easy strategy with high rates and quantitative tightening. And you might say, well, Ben, they cut rates. And I would say, so what? Dominance went up for a couple months after they cut rates last cycle too. So get that out of here, right? It did the same thing last cycle. And last cycle, dominance didn't top until QE began. And how can QE begin when you got, when you still have the economy still doing somewhat okay? That doesn't mean it can't change, right? And maybe that change occurs after 60% Bitcoin dominance, where the money printer gets turned back on, and then that's why dominance tops out. But if you look at monthly candles for Bitcoin dominance, monthly Heikin-Ashi candles, there hasn't been a single red candle since November of 2022. Not a single one. Yes, if you look at regular candles, there have been, but you can't expect a stochastic process to be up only, right? There's going to be periods where it goes back down to make people think that they are right? To make the faders of Bitcoin dominance to think that they are right and that their altcoin is going to outperform Bitcoin. But I told you guys 3 years ago, it's a 3-year process, and by the end of it, most people will just be turned into a Bitcoin maxi, and that's when the alts finally bottom out against Bitcoin. Also, furthermore, altcoins don't always bottom out against Bitcoin at the same time that alts bottom out against the US dollar. Okay? And we're going to talk about 2 scenarios where, and you're going to need to be prepared for either of them, right? And I'm going to lay them out as cleanly as I can, so you know what to expect going into the end of the year. But Bitcoin dominance at 59% is a big milestone. There very well could be a pullback at some point, but I think it's going to go to 60%. Now, one of the things that you have to ask yourself, and if you're not asking yourself this, then you're not really thinking about it as critically as you probably should be, right? And this is something that I'm honestly struggling with myself. And I want to be honest with you. I don't want to, to hide anything. I want to tell you when I'm wrong about something. I want to tell you if I'm right and why I think I'm right and why I think I'll continue to be right. But just because I've been right is no guarantee that dominance even goes to 60%. Wouldn't it be poetic if it topped at 59? Now, I don't think it's going to top at 59. I think it's more likely to overshoot 60 than to top at 59. But let's talk about 2 elephants in the room, because there's 2 of them, and we're going to address both of them. The first elephant in the room is dominance is already at 59%. But Ben, you've been saying for years that alt Bitcoin pairs will go to the range lows. For years, you've been saying 0.25, right? They're oscillators at best. Altcoins are not oscillators at worst, right? Don't tell me your altcoin's a lot better now than it was a year ago. It's probably not, right? And frankly, a lot of the altcoins that you could justify are better than they were a year ago. People don't even care about them because they're just too busy YOLOing into meme coins, which is going to present a problem for the cryptoverse in the future. The fact that people keep focusing on the things they shouldn't focus on rather than the things that they should. So if my view on alt Bitcoin pairs is correct and they go to the range low, which I don't know why they wouldn't, right? And you might say, well, what about stablecoins? I'm already subtracting out USDT, right? And everything else is basically just a rounding error. Okay, I mean, yes, there's USDC, yes, there's DAI, yes, there's a few other stablecoins, but at the end of the day, it's going to more or less be a rounding error, right? It's not going to have a huge effect. USDT has a much bigger effect. Now, you could take out USDT too, and if you want to do that, just so you'll get off my back, I can quickly do that, but I'm just going to go right back to this one. But if you put in USDC as well, you get this chart, which doesn't look that different, right? I mean, it's at 0.34, and the implication is that it would go down to 0.25, right? So, yes, it's possible. It's possible that alt Bitcoin pairs don't go all the way down to 0.25. Maybe they bottom out a little bit above that. But you can't fault me for thinking they are oscillators at best. In fact, you might say, why at best? Why not just say they're oscillators? Because this looks like they're oscillating up and down and up and down. So why are they not just called oscillators? That's a good question, and I'm glad you asked. The reason, right? The reason is, if I can find what it is I want to actually show you. Where's the parallel channel stuff? I don't even remember where this stuff is. I'm too excited right now. Parallel channel. The reason why they're oscillators at best is because, technically speaking, this is a low, this is a high. This is a lower low, this is a lower high. So, again, as I said in prior Bitcoin dominance videos, I am throwing the degens a bone by saying that they're oscillators at best, because I am choosing to ignore the high and the lower high and the low and the lower low. I'm choosing to ignore that in favor of the degen point of view. The point of view that says, you know what? This is a high, and this is a low, and this is a deviation above the range high, and this is a deviation below the range low. Now, individually, a lot of altcoins do turn into bleeders against Bitcoin, but there's always new altcoins coming onto the scene, a lot of which that I'm completely out of touch with because I've just stuck with Bitcoin for the last several years. But this is the question. How in the world can Bitcoin dominance top at 60%? It's already at 59, right? How can it top at 60 if alt Bitcoin pairs are going to drop another 32 to 33%, right? There's this, and it's bothering me, right? It is, but I don't really have, I don't really have the answer, but I will talk, I'll give you a couple of thoughts, right? I'll give you a couple of thoughts. One possibility is that, and again, I'm not sure how much I believe this at this point. One possibility is that ETH Bitcoin bounces while alt Bitcoin pairs drop. Doesn't really seem like the most likely outcome, right? But it is a possibility. Now, if ETH Bitcoin bounced while alt Bitcoin pairs dropped, that could temper the extent of the Bitcoin dominance rally, right? And one reason why that could be the case is if you look at alt Bitcoin pairs, it looks like they're only just now starting to break down. But if you look at ETH Bitcoin, it already broke down long ago, right? It broke down long ago, and it already went through its typical bottoming process where, you have your sort of your breakdown from the low, and then ETH Bitcoin then theoretically should bottom within 2 to 3 months, right? Here it was 2 months, and then here it was 3 months, and we're already in the third month, right? So there does exist a scenario where dominance only goes to 60, even on an alt Bitcoin pair capitulation, because ETH Bitcoin, which I consider to be somewhat between Bitcoin and alts, is going up during that time. Now, is that the most likely outcome? It's a tough call, especially considering that I think ETH is going to go home in Q4, right, to the lower logarithmic regression trend line. So I don't know how much faith I put in that. I do know that last cycle, though, from a time-based perspective, yes, it was 2 to 3 months, but it also did not bottom last cycle until the Fed began to expand their balance sheet. They haven't started doing that yet, and so perhaps it's still reasonable to assume that ETH Bitcoin might go lower, although I don't think it's going to go that much lower, right? I would say if 0.038 does not hold, 0.036. If 0.036 does not hold, worst case is 0.03 for this cycle, is what I would say. So then, how do we get past this? How do we rationalize this? Right? How can it be that alt Bitcoin pairs can drop 30-something% and Bitcoin dominance tops at 60? Well, there's a chance it doesn't top at 60. There's a chance it goes beyond 60. On ITC Premium about a year ago, I put out a post. It was called "Do You Know What Keeps Me Up at Night?" Right? That's what it's called. And in that video, or sorry, in that message, I almost wonder if I can find it. Let me see if I can find it. Here we go. This was something I posted to ITC Premium back in 2023. I just want to share it with you so that we're all on the same page. All right. I don't want there to be, I'm not trying to pull the wool over your eyes or anything like that, right? But this is, let me see if I can get a better. Oh, I think it was just transparent on here. Let me see if I can change the, here we go. I just want to share this with you for a minute. This was shared in ITC Premium a year ago, in fact. This was when dominance was like 50%. I said, what really keeps me up at night? It is a 60% target I've given on Bitcoin dominance. This was back when everyone was calling for the flippening and all this other garbage, right? But not because I think it cannot get there. The reason it keeps me up is because I'm worried that I say alts are goodbye at 60% dominance, and then we see dominance go higher to 70%. Now, I don't think it's going to happen, but that's what kept me up at night. What if dominance is not a bleeder? What if it's an oscillator? A bleeder puts in a lower low. Bitcoin dominance, despite all the money printing, VC shows, etc., did not put in a lower low. So do I stay up at night wondering what alts I should recommend to you? No. I stay up worried that I'm going to be bullish on alts at 60% dominance, only for them to watch bit dominance go to 70%. 60% is still my target. As an investor, it is important to consider all scenarios, right? For me, it's been a long journey. At 60%, I'm going to hang up my Bitcoin maxi hat, right? I will hang it up and I will see what happens. I'll see where dominance goes. I cannot, in good faith, be a Bitcoin dominance bull for 3 years and say 60% is the target, only to change that target as it arrives. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. 60% is the target. But could it overshoot the target? Absolutely. Is it going to go to 70%? Almost assuredly not. Right? Almost assuredly not. And the reason why Bitcoin dominance will likely not go is there's no, it can. The reason why it likely will not go back up here is for the reasons people told you Bitcoin dominance wouldn't go to 60%. They were right about the thought process, but they underestimated how strong Bitcoin would be relative to the altcoin market. Right? So their thought process is right? It's not wrong to think that stablecoin dominance affects Bitcoin dominance. It absolutely does. If you look at USDT dominance, you can see that it's at 5.3%. In 2019, when dominance was topping out, USDT dominance was only like 1%, right? And if dominance goes higher, if USDT dominance goes to like 7%, that's that number, right? If USDT did not exist, then Bitcoin dominance would be a lot higher. Right. It would already be above 60%. If you took out USDT out of the entire market cap of the asset class, the dominance of everything else would increase, right, proportionally. So if USDT dominance did not exist, right, and let's add on, let's say, all right, well, why don't we add on USDC dominance, right? And then we'll see where that gets us, right? That's already at almost 7%. It's already almost at 7%. So that's the reason. That is the reason why it's unlikely to hit 70. But could it overshoot 60? It could, right? It could. One thing to think about here is adding these up, right? Adding them together. And so what you're going to do, what we should do is add up Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance. And look at this, guys. Right at, when the Fed was cutting last cycle, Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance. Why don't we come up with a nickname for it? Like, let's call it flight to safety, right? Because if you value your portfolio in terms of US dollars, your flight to safety is USDT potentially. I'm not saying it should be, but and if you want to stay in crypto, and if your flight to safety within crypto, like if you value your portfolio in terms of satoshis, which is what I think is important, Bitcoin dominance is important. And sure enough, this is breaking out basically around the same time it broke out last cycle. Last cycle, this is where the first rate cut was. This cycle, this is where the first rate cut is. And you can see that it's breaking out at the exact same point in the cycle, more or less. More or less. Breaking out the exact same time. So, it makes sense to assume that it will continue to go higher. Why? Because last cycle, this metric did not top until QE returned. And that has not yet happened. It has not happened yet. And so it makes sense to assume they're going to go higher. They could go higher together. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, well, USDT dominance, isn't it kind of going down right now? Well, I mean, it has been for the last couple of weeks. But how do we know for sure? How do we know for sure this isn't just a higher low on USDT dominance, and every single higher low, everyone's getting all worked up over, and they're YOLOing into altcoins and saying alt season is here, and then Bitcoin gets a correction and rips the alts into it, right? And those alt season calls are premature for the 7,000th time over the last 3 years, right? Is that a possibility that USDT dominance is just putting in a higher low again, right? Is it possible? Could be, right? And if Bitcoin sneezes, if Bitcoin drops at all, right? The altcoin market isn't going to like that, right? The altcoin market at this point is completely reliant on the idea that the top is not in, right? And the longer we go without putting in a new high, the altcoin market gets more and more jittery, right? Because the altcoin market, as I said, if Bitcoin goes up, the altcoin market can go up. But the altcoin market's not going to lead the QT bull market, right? This is the mistake a lot of ETH maxis made, thinking that ETH outperformed Bitcoin in a bull market. It outperforms Bitcoin in a QE bull market, but in a QT bull market, you're better off with the king, right? And even last cycle, when Bitcoin USD was going up in 2019, people thought ETH was going to outperform Bitcoin then, and it didn't, right? Bitcoin went up, ETH went down. Same things happened this time, right? It's just that it's lasted longer because the rate hiking cycle lasted longer. This is why understanding higher for longer was so important. This is why you had to fade the people that told you the terminal rate was 3.5%. And the only reason their altcoin went up was because Bitcoin went up. If Bitcoin hadn't gone up, their altcoin would be nowhere right now, right? These people are living this dream of their altcoin leads the bull market, when in reality, even the ones that have done the best that existed last cycle are still looking at lower highs against Bitcoin. So, is this trend going to change? Absolutely. Is it going to change soon? Probably. My guess is that Bitcoin dominance will top at approximately 60%. Could it go a little bit higher? Yeah. Could it top out before 60? Probably not, right? Probably not. If it did, I would be extremely surprised. And again, the reason, look at all Bitcoin pairs, right? I mean, this is a 30% drop, I think, that needs to happen. Why? Well, I've talked before of balance sheets of central banks, right? Net liquidity. You don't have to call it that. You can call it whatever you want. But there's no denying, right? There's no denying. You can try to deny it, but if anyone who's denied it for the last few years has been wrong. If you overlay net liquidity onto the alt Bitcoin pair chart, you will see they track each other pretty closely. And when alt Bitcoin pairs almost broke down a few months ago, you can see that at the same time, the net liquidity was breaking down. Right here, you see that? Net liquidity was breaking down, and alt Bitcoin pairs looked like they were about to break down in the summer of 2024, just like ETH Bitcoin was. But then what happened? Net liquidity bounced. Why did net liquidity bounce? Because the dollar was going down. And net liquidity is it's a composition of balance sheets from different central banks. And if you're going to convert that local currency to US dollars and the dollar is going down, that means that is higher purchasing power. But instead, recently, what has happened after the first rate cut? Well, basically, precisely what we said, right? It's going to rally. Why did we say the dollar was going to rally? Because the long end of the yield curve was going to rally. Because unless there was an immediate sign that the economy was falling apart, right? Unless there was an immediate sign that it was all going to crumble down, then basically you have the dollar pricing in a recession and rate cuts here, and then you're like, oh crap, now you have a 50 basis point rate cut, and now all of a sudden, the unemployment rate has dropped, 0.2, and real GDP is still trending at 3%. Like what's the Fed doing, right? So if all of a sudden recession fears get distilled, at least temporarily, and it could go on like this for months or quarters, right? It doesn't have to happen immediately, right? But if these fears are distilled right now, which they have been, there's no choice but for the long end of the yield curve to rally, right? There's no choice. You can't have it both ways, right? Like you can't have rate cuts and also expect the long end of the yield curve to stay at 3.6% when the real economy is still trending at 3% real GDP. You can't, right? You can't have it both ways. It's either the economy's falling apart and these rate cuts are justified, therefore the market should be pricing in a recession and not the reacceleration of inflation or expansion, or it goes back up. And when I said this, I said, look at the 2-year. It's testing this, it's sweeping this low. It's likely going to rally back up to the bull market support band at the very least. The 10-year yield could easily rally to 4.3 to 4.4%. Just to backtest this. And in fact, the last 2 Octobers, October of 2022 and October of 2023, the long end of the yield curve rallied on up. So why not, right? Why not? A lot of you guys like to compare this cycle to 2016. What happened in 2016 in Q4? The dollar rally. By the way, there was a recession scare back then too, right? And then we got a soft landing. It wasn't an inverted yield curve, but there were still some places in the world that I think did slip into a recession. But you look at the dollar, look at this. Weakness in August, September, and then a massive move by the dollar in Q4. Massive move in Q4. And then it topped at the end of the year. So, you are right that Bitcoin dominance will likely turn around in 2025. I've been saying it forever. But the final rally by the dollar that causes net liquidity to drop is precisely what will take alt Bitcoin pairs down to the range low, right? That's what'll take them down to 0.25. Now, I'll try to have some flexibility on 0.25. I mostly just care about dominance getting to 60%, right? If they're at 0.26, 0.27, I'm not going to nickel and dime you on that, okay? Especially if dominance is at that level, and especially knowing that, there is USDC dominance, that's going to take a hit, or that's going to have some type of an effect, and that's already at 0.33 or something, not 0.37, and the low is still 0.25. But this is still likely going to break down, right? And it's probably going to go sub 0.3. Okay? It's probably going to go, you're likely going to see it in the 0.2s before too long. Now, there's something that we got to talk about, right? And I don't like talking about it because honestly, again, trying to be honest, right? I want people, it's a struggle, right? I know a lot of people at the beginning of this do not like the Bitcoin dominance view. And, as an influencer, for lack of a better term, people, you want people to like you, right? You don't want people to not like you. And so, it's easy to struggle with, like, what do I say? What do I not say? It's kind of like being a politician almost. Like, how do I say stuff? Like, how do I express my opinion without pissing people off? But there's one thing that I keep trying to wrap my head around, right? I've struggled with it, and I want to show you a perspective on the market that we must consider in Q4, because the bullish case is very clear to everyone for Q4, right? And I will just quickly, I'll show you what I'm talking about, but I want to talk about the other view too, right? The bullish case is just, look, Ben, stop overcomplicating things. You look at having our ROI 2024, 2020, 2016, 2012, every single time Bitcoin goes up in Q4 of having a year, right? Stop overcomplicating it. If you look at ROI from the bottom, this is the time Bitcoin normally moves up. This is why we said, be prepared for a late October rally for Bitcoin. This is when it normally moves up as at this point in the cycle, right? This is when it goes up. And, right, you could look at 2016 specifically, when the dollar went up, because some people think, well, how can Bitcoin go up if the dollar's going up? That's exactly what happened in 2016, right? I mean, that is exactly what happened in 2016. The dollar went up in Q4, and so did Bitcoin. You see? I guess you don't see, because I don't actually have something on there that's showing 2016. Look. Dollar went up in Q4, so did Bitcoin. But ETH went down in Q4 of 2016. You see this? ETH went down. Bitcoin was strong enough to overcome the dollar rally. ETH was not. And Bitcoin dominance went up. Where I am struggling with this, is that seasonality is bullish, right? Monetary policy view is bearish. And it's easy to dismiss the monetary policy view, right? Crypto exists, it's a cycle. It exists outside of this. It doesn't matter about monetary policy. But I will tell you this. It was monetary policy, right? Out of everything, it was monetary policy that helped me stay the course on Bitcoin dominance, right? Because if you looked at Bitcoin dominance, excluding stables, in halving years, it normally doesn't do that good, right? I mean, it normally bleeds until the third quarter and then maybe rallies up a little bit in Q4, but still not that impressive, right? And this is why so many people went into 2024 saying that ETH was going to outperform Bitcoin. They were calling for the flippening. Now, those same people calling for the flippening back then are now calling for the demise of ETH. It's funny how the market has tricked them. But look at 2024. It's completely different than the last two halving years. Completely different. It's never stopped. The dominance has never stopped going up. Normally at this point, right, Bitcoin dominance is 10 to 15% below the yearly open. But this cycle, it's 10 to 15% above the yearly open. Why? Because of monetary policy, right? So a lot of bullish things for Bitcoin. And I said late October is going to be the time where it should have a go at trying to take out the lower high structure, right? This would be the time. If it's going to do it, it's going to do it now. It does not have time to wait around much longer. And I will tell you exactly why. Right? So this is the lower high structure by Bitcoin. It has not yet been taken out. It's basically the inverse of the USDT dominance. Remember the higher low trend line? It's the exact same thing, just reversed. The reason you could argue that altcoins are stuck in traffic on struggle street and going down while Bitcoin goes up is because USDT dominance does not want to go below that trend line. Right? It does not. It wants to stay above, its trend line, and therefore it's not wanting to go down. So every incremental move up by Bitcoin is an incremental move lower by alts. so that USDT dominance can continue its trend. From a time-based perspective in 2019, this is the time where Bitcoin broke out, right? It's been about 30 weeks, right? This was how long it took back then, about 29, 30 weeks. It's been that long. From that perspective, you could argue it's time, right? It's time. But I just want to show you one other perspective, and I can't get out of my head. And I mean, look, guys, I've said it a million times. If you haven't caught on by now, I don't know what to tell you. But monetary policy has not been a good idea to fade this year. It's not been a good idea to fade it. And so I will show you this one more time, just in case the Moon Boys are wrong again, right? In case they're promising you 100K and they're wrong again. Well, what do we look towards? We look towards monetary policy. And so what happened when the Fed cut last cycle? All I care about, right? What happened when the Fed cut last cycle? Let's pretend like the time-based component isn't important for a minute. The Fed cut here. And when the Fed cut, Bitcoin rallied to a lower high, right? It rallied to a lower high. And in that rally, Bitcoin dominance went to its penultimate top. The top before the final top, right? So it went here on that lower high rally. You see what I'm saying, right? Penultimate top, lower high after the first rate cut. And then following that, Bitcoin bled back down for 3 weeks. And then it got one more rally, one more green candle. And on that green candle was the final top by Bitcoin dominance. You see? It's clear as mud, right? I mean, you can see it. It's not rocket science. Rate cut, rally to a lower high, penultimate top by Bitcoin dominance, right? Penultimate top, second to last. Pullback, one more little move by Bitcoin, 2 months after the first rate cut. That would be November. And then what happened? The drop, the scary drop to the 100-week moving average. But remember, Bitcoin dominance topped before Bitcoin durably fell below the bull market support band. It topped here, right? It topped the week of September 2nd, and then a few weeks later, it fell to the 100-week moving average. Now, do you want to see something really interesting, right? Remember everything I just said. If 60% is the target, what if we're putting in our penultimate top by Bitcoin dominance now? And that's this rally to the lower high structure, right? What if that's where we are right now, where it's a rally to the lower high structure following the first rate cut, everyone YOLOs in again, and then nothing comes of it. And then we just find ourselves back down to 60K in a couple of weeks. Because that's what happened in 2019 after the first rate cut. And then you might get one more little rally in November following the next rate cut, which is in like 3 weeks, which would correspond to this. And that rally might get you to the final target of 60% Bitcoin dominance before the end of the year. Could play out, right? I mean, it's not like it's impossible for it to play out. And the scary part about that for a lot of people, because again, I want people to like me. I do. I don't really want to fade Bitcoin in Q4 of a halving year, as I showed you earlier. I mean, it's dangerous to fade it, and that's why I'll just stick with Bitcoin. Because hell, guys, if this view is right and Bitcoin does eventually go to the 100-week SMA like it did in 2019, a few months after rate cuts, there's still a good chance it's going to take a while to get there, right? I mean, the writing would probably be on the wall, right? Like if Bitcoin drops back to 60K in November and then it gets a little bit of a rally and it's just like, yeah, it's nothing, then yeah, it's probably a good chance that it's just going to fade back down. I think a lot of people are waiting to see if that October seasonality really kicks in and can get Bitcoin to a higher high, right? And please distill my fear and get Bitcoin to a higher high. The problem is that's what happened in 2020. Bitcoin went to a higher high and it still crashed. But I don't really think you should look at the pandemic crash as something that, could have been predicted, right? So I look at it and I just think to myself, everyone's calling for alt season on a Bitcoin dominance top. There does exist a scenario where Bitcoin dominance tops and alt season does not immediately begin. Last cycle, when dominance topped, right after that, dominance went down, but it was going down on a Bitcoin dump to the 100-week moving average. The only reason Bitcoin dominance was going down was because Bitcoin was dropping faster than the altcoin market. QE had arrived and rate cuts had arrived. There just hadn't been enough rate cuts and there hadn't been enough QE. So people were speculating on altcoins, but because the demand for Bitcoin had reduced because people were taking on more risk, the floor fell out, Bitcoin fell to the 100-week moving average, which would represent a soft landing. Just look at this for a minute. You have your broadening descending wedge, whatever the experts want to call it, right? Let's hope Bitcoin can just break through. I don't want to deal with this anymore, right? I'm fine. If Bitcoin wants to just break out here and you send Bitcoin dominance to 60% on a Bitcoin rally, so be it, right? I have no problem with my portfolio value going up. That's fine with me. But if it can't break out and USDT dominance holds the line again and it sells off, what would be really interesting is that if it sells off down here, it would correspond to the 100-week moving average, which is exactly where Bitcoin sold off to in October of 2019. But remember September of 2019. But then the rate cut was in July. So September was 2 months after the first rate cut. This time, 2 months after the first rate cut is not September, it's November, which is next month. So if Bitcoin sells off into the end of the year, then the 100-week moving average is the target. Right? Now, the reason why there are issues associated, in my mind, with Bitcoin breaking out while ETH goes down, why do I think ETH is going to go down? It's going to be on the quiz next week. It's because in 2016 and 2019 and the summer of 2024, every single of those, all of those years, that's when ETH Bitcoin broke support, right? The ETH Bitcoin chart, if you think about it, when did it break support? It broke support in summer of 2016, right? Well, broke here, and then it rallied, and then it really broke again. Summer of 2019 and summer of 2024. Right here, April, and then it really broke in August or so, July, August. Every single year that ETH Bitcoin broke down in the past, ETH USD then dropped until Q4 was over, right? Until like December of that year, right? This is December of 2016. This is December of 2019. And this could be December of 2024, which would be exactly where the lower logarithmic regression trend line is. Why is it that Bitcoin put in a new all-time high and ETH has not? It's because Bitcoin already went home, right? Bitcoin went home long ago, right? Because it has its own regression channel. If I can find it. Right? It went home, it even went below home long ago. So it already had the juice to go to all-time highs. But ETH never went home, right? And I know people laugh about it, but the reality is it also never put in all-time highs. So I don't know why you're laughing, right? So if the base case is that ETH Bitcoin breaking down sends ETH home by December 2016, December 2019, and December 2024. How does ETH go home? Does it go home on a Bitcoin rally? Does it go home on a Bitcoin dump? In 2016, when Bitcoin rallied in Q4, Bitcoin was putting in higher highs all year long, right? It was putting in higher highs all year long. In 2019, when Bitcoin dropped in Q4, it had already started the lower high structure, right? The lower high and lower low structure, and it dropped in Q4 rather than rally. So, when you think about it like that, right? When you think about that view of the market, and you think, well, you know, what happens if that plays out again, right? You have to wonder what has been taking ETH down so far this year. Every single low by ETH was accompanied by a Bitcoin low, right? If you overlay Bitcoin USD, right? Every low, April low, Bitcoin was dropping. August low, Bitcoin was dropping. December low. 2016, the monthly ETH USD candles are the same in 2024 as they were in 2016. Same exact thing. You count them. I mean, look, every green candle. January, February, March, 2016 and 2024, green. April, red. May, green. June, July, August, red for all three, or red for both. September was green in both cases. October, November, December, red. October so far is red. If it's not red, if it's slightly green, it'll look more like 2019, where you get two little green candles here below the bull market support band, and then it capitulates in November, December. And where does it capitulate? Home. You see how the similarities? So it's really hard for me to see a scenario in my head where Bitcoin rallies in Q4 and ETH drops, right? It's really hard to imagine that. Although it shouldn't be, because right now ETH is down 1% this month and Bitcoin is up 5%. So maybe it shouldn't be hard to rally. Maybe it shouldn't be hard. What I will say is this. You don't know. I don't know. Right? We don't know what's going to happen. There's no way to know if it's on a Bitcoin rally or a Bitcoin dump. And I can't know if Bitcoin's going to go to the 100-week SMA. I can guarantee you guys, I don't want you guys getting the pitchforks out if it breaks out to higher highs. So I'm telling you guys, until dominance is at 60%, you're still likely going to see some durable strength by Bitcoin. It doesn't mean it can't go back to 60K and then bounce again back up to 64. Like, even if it goes to the 100-week moving average, it would still bounce around here for at least a few more weeks, right? And if that view is wrong, if my interpretation of that is wrong, and it just breaks out to a higher high here, then you're better off holding. You were still better off holding Bitcoin. There just doesn't really exist a scenario in the short term where the altcoin market is a better play than Bitcoin. That doesn't mean like tomorrow it can't go up, right? I mean, certainly tomorrow maybe all Bitcoin pairs will go up, but especially with dominance at 59%, like if this is the penultimate top for Bitcoin dominance. By the way, if this is the penultimate top, if dominance drops here, let's say it drops back down to 58, 58.5, then that would raise the likelihood that dominance does top at 60% if it just plays out exactly like it did last cycle. What's interesting, by the way, about that view is if it does go back to the 100-week SMA, that would correspond to the yearly open, right, for Bitcoin. And it would also correspond to exactly where it dropped last cycle, 2 months after the first rate cut, to the 100-week moving average. So you can't ignore it. I'm just saying, if Bitcoin is back down here at like, you know, around 40K by December, it's exactly 2019 all over again. It's exactly 2019. And instead of the time-based comparison of breakout after 6 months, you could still argue we're up in this phase where Bitcoin is still absorbing that altcoin liquidity, and then the drop to the 100-week SMA just hasn't happened yet. So Bitcoin dominance is the way to navigate the market, right? It basically allows you to have exposure to something that gives you exposure to the upside, but it also minimizes your downside risk. Because if Bitcoin does drop, it'll still probably eventually recover, right? And if Bitcoin drops a lot, then it will completely annihilate some of the altcoins, right? Absolutely annihilate some of the altcoins. So you got to be careful, right? You got to be careful with the altcoin market. You know, I've said before, ETH Bitcoin will probably bottom out between 0.03 to 0.04. So I'm looking for it to form that structural low. Dot Bitcoin, I don't know what to say. It just keeps on going lower. Link Bitcoin, still, you know, basically new lows. A Litecoin Bitcoin. What else is new? ADA Bitcoin. I just told you guys 3 years ago it was going to go to 400 sats. And you know, the Cardano community dunked on me on Twitter, and now it's at 511 sats. Sol Bitcoin, what I think is going to happen, I think it's going to follow ETH Bitcoin. I think it's going to fall down here and then bounce back up in early 2025 is what I think. I think it's going to do something like that. That's what I think Sol Bitcoin will do. AVAX Bitcoin is probably just going to bleed back down to the low. And I've been saying that all year. This pattern looks a lot like the Dash Bitcoin pattern from a cycle far, far away. Right? Dash Bitcoin sets the lows, gets a big bounce in the halving year here, and then spends all year bleeding back down, and then eventually takes it out. And then gets a little bit of a rally in the post-halving year, but it's still just a lower high, and the rest is history. It's interesting how this is all played out so similarly, right? I mean, like, if you look at another reason why 60% was the target was because the last cycle when dominance broke down, you know, the 618 was where Bitcoin dominance topped. This cycle, the 618 corresponds to 60%. And I told you guys back when it passed the 0.5 fib, that's what marked the mid-cycle top last cycle, right? When Bitcoin dominance passed the 0.5 fib. And sure enough, it marked it again this cycle. Bitcoin dominance passes 0.5 fib. Here, Bitcoin USD tops. But then Bitcoin dominance continues to go up while Bitcoin USD puts in lower highs. The same exact thing is happening this cycle, right? Bitcoin USD past the Bitcoin dominance past the 0.5 fib. Bitcoin USD tops, but then Bitcoin dominance continues to go up while Bitcoin USD puts in lower highs. It's the same thing as last cycle. The same thing. So my view is this. Just to be clear. I think that Bitcoin dominance will top at around 60%. It's more likely to make it, it's more likely to overshoot 60 than not make it there because of how far alt Bitcoin pairs are off their lows. When Bitcoin dominance tops, whether that's the bottom for alt USD pairs or not will depend on when it happens. If Bitcoin dominance hits 60% soon, then it's more likely that Bitcoin dominance will then go down and then alt USD pairs go down until the end of the year. But if Bitcoin dominance gets a pullback at 59 and then slowly grinds back up to 60 between now and the end of the year, then you could get a situation like ETH Bitcoin where it bottoms out at the same time as ETH USD. Like in 2016, ETH USD capitulated in Q4 and ETH Bitcoin found its final low in Q4, right? And then the market went up the following year. So then it corresponded to the bottom. But last cycle in 2019, when ETH Bitcoin bottomed, Bitcoin USD was still not even, it was only halfway through its downtrend, right? It was only halfway through its downtrend. And it was also, you know, right before Bitcoin USD dropped to the 100-week moving average. So that's where we stand with Bitcoin dominance. That's where we stand. It's been a long journey. I'm happy for those that have tagged along. I'm really appreciative of those that, you know, didn't just give me a hard time about it for the last 3 years and troll me and laugh at it and mock it. The reality is, if you stuck with Bitcoin for the last 3 years, you've been so much better off than chasing the latest and greatest altcoin. If you did chase altcoins and you made a lot of money, I congratulate you. I tip my hat. I'm not against you. Okay. It's just that if you did it, you're 1 out of 100 probably, because a lot of people probably just lost money trading altcoins. And for every altcoin that outperformed Bitcoin, there's probably 100 others that underperformed or went to zero. Okay. If you look at dominance excluding stables, it just keeps on putting in higher highs. And now it's at 62.36%. And really, excluding stables is probably the better way to look at it, right? Then you don't even have to worry about the stablecoin dominance. You just say, well, where could it go, right? I mean, how high could it go? So we will see. We will see what happens to alt Bitcoin pairs. I know that last cycle when alt Bitcoin pairs broke down, they started to move quickly. And I don't know what's been taking them so long, but we've been following this really, really closely for a while. And one of the things I've said is that sometimes you get into a situation where you have a low, the market doesn't really want to go below that low, but eventually it does, but then it keeps fighting to get back above it, and then it requires the bull market support band to come down to that low to say, you know what? You shall not pass. And this is where you get rejected, and this is where you go to the range low. And that's exactly what's happening, right? Alt Bitcoin pair is rejected here. Look at others Bitcoin. 0.16. And I talked about this a long time, right? I mean, last cycle, they did the same thing. Others Bitcoin dropped 60, rallied 60, dropped 60 after rate cuts. Same thing this cycle, right? Drop 60, rally 60. They've already dropped 40. Everyone keeps thinking the low's in. What if it's not, right? What if it drops below that? I could be on board with others Bitcoin bottoming out here if dominance is at 60%, but until that happens, I'm still bearish on others Bitcoin. Because normally what happens is others Bitcoin sets a low, rallies, sweeps the low, rallies to the bull market support band, gets rejected, goes down, right? Low, rally, sweep the low, rally to the bull market support band, get rejected, go down. And I pointed this out well in advance. People YOLO'd into alts the entire way down. They laughed at me when they rallied back up to the 20-week SMA, and now they're getting rejected once again. This isn't telling people exactly what's going to happen and being lucky, because I certainly don't get everything right, and then it happening and people acting like it was impossible to see coming. But this is exactly what happened last cycle. Exactly. The only difference between this cycle and last cycle is the hiking cycle took longer, right? This part of the cycle took longer, so then it took longer over here too. But it's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's just a larger version of it. So my guess in the short term is that Bitcoin will still stay around these levels, for a while longer. If the optimistic view is right, if the year-to-date ROI and having view seasonality is right, it should break out soon. Okay, if it can't break out by November, then you got to ask yourself, is it just going to play out like last cycle, be a lower high, send us to the 100-week SMA by November? That's what I'm looking out for. I don't know yet. I'll try to keep you guys updated, but I feel very conflicted. Because normally for Q4 having years are bullish and cycle ROI looks bullish. The only main thing that looks bearish is the monetary policy component, and how the monetary policy component has helped with the being on the right side of Bitcoin dominance for the last 3 years. So I can't ignore it as much as I want to. I can't ignore it. I have to show you guys, even if you hate me, even if it's not true, right? Even if Bitcoin rallies to a higher high and it's not true, I have to present it to you, because if I don't, and then the market follows 2019 into the 100-week SMA, I want you guys to be prepared for that outcome and not be completely caught off guard. So, I mean, it could mean having a Bitcoin position and then having some cash set aside in case that's where we go by the end of the year. So that's where we stand. And I think I showed you guys, I mean, the whole net liquidity thing, net liquidity is rolling over, which is why alt Bitcoin pairs should follow. And I think the other issue is that one of the reasons I think alt Bitcoin pairs are struggling a lot recently is because a lot of the aggressive rate cuts that were probably the reason why alt Bitcoin pairs rallied in the first place. Like, one of the main reasons that others Bitcoin was rallying in the first place was probably because of all the aggressive rate cuts getting priced in. But then now all of a sudden, a lot of those aggressive rate cuts have been priced out, right? Rather than getting 2 more 50 basis point rate cuts, now the market's just saying only 2 more 25 basis point rate cuts. The market doesn't like that. Altcoins don't like that. They need those rate cuts. Last cycle, it took 75 basis points of rate cuts and QE out of a terminal rate of 250 to turn this around. This cycle, the terminal rate is 550. And so far, we've only had 50 basis points of rate cuts. And by the way, when it turned around, others' Bitcoin was going up, but others' USD was dropping because Bitcoin was dropping. It's just that others' USD was dropping slower than Bitcoin. It's got to be a view in your mind, guys. It's got to be a view in your mind. It can't be something that you ignore. Let's get Bitcoin to a higher high, and then say to hell with that theory. But if that can't happen, and we're still playing in the sandbox over here, thinking we're here, then I just want you to be prepared for that outcome. And so far, Bitcoin dominance supports that view. It does, so far. So let's see what the end of the year holds. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. Again, we do have ITC Premium. Add into the Cryptoverse.com. Links in the description below. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.